Good morning. It's 11 a.m. and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We have about 130 participants on the webinar and that number is going up. My name is Matthew Hansen. I'm an Associate Managing Director with Witt O'Brien's, supporting the Office of Recovery in Kansas. And I want to thank you for joining another in a series of webinars. Today's webinar is Laying the Foundation, so pre-award grant setup. Next slide, Micah. So today we're hoping to accomplish several things. What is the local fiscal recovery fund and how can I apply for dollars? This is just a refresher of information for most of you. As you know, there are 105 counties, 10 major metropolitan cities, and 614 non-entitlement units of government who are all eligible for this funding and who have all been invited to today's webinar. The next item we hope to cover is what should your jurisdiction consider before any issuance of the local fiscal recovery fund dollars? So I'm sure you're having lots of conversations about allowability and investment options. Today is going to be much more a focus on compliance and oversight and sort of back office considerations. And then lastly, what steps can you be taking now to prepare for receiving the funding if you have not yet received it, and ultimately starting the expenditure of your local fiscal recovery fund dollars. The webinars to date have really been about high-level allowability and Treasury guidance. This webinar and future webinars are planned to really start to drill down on specific operational and compliance issues. Please note that in addition to the series of webinars that the Recovery Office is offering every 2 weeks, the Recovery Office is going to start offering office hours to field general questions, with the first one scheduled for tomorrow. And as always, please can you continue to use the inquiry form available on the RO's website. Next slide. So we have shared this slide in the past, and we will continue to do so, just to a reminder about the various streams of funding coming into the state. The governor's office, the Office of Recovery, is receiving ARPA, state fiscal recovery funds directly. Not only the discretionary money, but also the capital projects fund money, which is anticipated to be received this summer. The 105 counties and 10 major metropolitan cities have or will be receiving their allocations directly from Treasury. And then the 614 non-entitlement units are in the process of applying for and will receive their money through the state. Additionally, state agencies are receiving program-specific dollars directly. So considerable investment of funding coming into the state of Kansas. Also, just a reminder that the state and local fiscal recovery funding is coming in 2 tranches. So currently we're talking about the first tranche of 50%, with the second coming in 2022. And what this slide continues to highlight is the need for careful coordination to leverage the various funding available and to prevent duplication of benefit among subrecipients and beneficiaries of the funding. So lots of streams, lots of silos of money moving through the state, and a lot of stakeholder engagement and coordination needs to happen to make sure we're using this money efficiently and wisely and not duplicating efforts. Next slide. So again, we've shared this slide before. It's an overall timeline, shows key dates and milestones of the ARPA, and subsequently Treasury issued materials. This timeline hopefully can assist you with program and expense planning. Some key takeaways include, in addition to the items listed on the slide, Treasury has issued an FAQ update on June 17th, a compliance and reporting guidance document on June 17th, another frequently asked question update on June 23rd, another one on June 24th. I mention these just to highlight that things are still very dynamic with guidance changing frequently. So you and your staffs really need to be checking the Treasury website frequently for the most up-to-date guidance. And also just a reminder, unlike the previous CARES Act, CRF funding, we have two different end dates. Funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024. So under contract and a commitment that the money is to be spent on a specific activity. But then you have an additional 2 years until December 31st, 2026 to actually expend and liquidate those transactions. Next slide. So we have a mixed audience on this webinar today. So we have two different slides. This is just really a reminder or refresher for you. So for the counties and major metropolitan cities eligible to receive ARPA funds directly from Treasury, you must submit a request for funding through the Treasury submission portal. Access to the portal is available on the Treasury website. The Treasury submission portal requirements are jurisdiction name, taxpayer ID, DUNS number, address, authorized rep. You must sign and agree to a grant agreement, as well as some compliance and assurances, and provide banking information. We provide this information before, based on what we've received from Treasury. About a third of the counties and major metropolitan cities in Kansas have completed this process. So we definitely encourage you to keep working through this process with Treasury to get your first tranche allocation. Dun & Bradstreet number we've talked about takes, they're saying 1 to 2 days to be issued. You should already, from previous federal grants, have a DUNS number. You might have multiple DUNS numbers. There's not a specific DUNS number you need to use for this process. It just needs to be a valid one. Next slide. For the 614 non-entitlement units, your process is a little different, as you'll have to apply for your funding through the state. The state has stood up a portal for you to submit your application, similar to what the counties and major metros have to provide. DUNS number, authorized rep, agree to the award terms and conditions, civil rights assurances. So pretty similar level of information. You just do it through a different process. Once your funding is allocated through the state, you're then a direct recipient with Treasury, and further compliance and reporting responsibilities will all go back to Treasury directly. For both NEUs and direct recipients of funding, you must also register with sam.gov before you'll be able to do any reporting on your funding. So start that process, because that process is taking 2 to 3 weeks to complete. For NEUs, please also note that it's critical that your applications are received by the state by July 26th for the state to meet the deadlines for distributing funding. But please note that the state's not going to wait. Funds will be distributed on a rolling basis. So the sooner you submit your request, the better. Once your application has been verified by the recovery office, your payment will be deposited into your bank account using the banking information in the state's central accounting system known as SMART. If your jurisdiction has more than one bank account associated with your supplier record, the bank account that will be used is the same one used for the gas tax paid to your entity on April 22nd, 2021. The gas tax payment is also referred to as the special highway tax dollars. So hopefully that'll help you, track down where the payment will go to. And if you have any concerns or questions about that, please reach out. Also, an email notification will be sent to you approximately 2 to 3 days prior to the date of the payment being made. So just a couple of housekeeping items there. I do see a question about the difference between an authorized rep and a contact person. They can be one and the same. The authorized rep will be the person from your jurisdiction who can sign a grant agreement, which is essentially a legal document with the federal government. They can be the same person. We would recommend that they're different, just so you have backup and you have multiple individuals receiving correspondence from Treasury going forward. The authorized rep would need to be an actual county or municipal employee, or it could be probably not a consultant, but an authorized maybe legal counsel, but generally it would be an individual employed by the jurisdiction. The state portal is available on the RO's website. You could also use the inquiry form and request the link, and we'll send the link to you directly. There has been an email communication gone out previously, and I believe there'll be another one in the next day or two with that information. And I don't want to get too far into questions, but there's one more. Can funds go into an interest-bearing account? Yes, they can go into an interest-bearing account, and that interest can be used for non-local fiscal recovery fund purposes. So interest accrued can be used for general government services. With that, next slide. So we want to just start really at the beginning and really just provide some leading questions and some items for your jurisdiction to think about and be considering, to focus on what to do to be ready and in compliance with the local fiscal recovery fund statute, uniform guidance, Treasury interim final rule, FAQs, etc. The next two slides provide you with questions to consider in advance of determining use of funds received. With the prior CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund, whether you receive those directly or as a pass-through from the state, there were very few federal flow-down requirements. In fact, there were only 5 compliance or federal flow-down requirements. With the American Rescue Plan Act, Local Fiscal Recovery Fund program is much different. Essentially, the entire federal uniform guidance applies to these funds. Things like suspension and debarment, along with procurement standards that were waived due to the pandemic emergency under CARES Act, are not waived now with the ARPA local fiscal recovery funds. So first and foremost, you need to be thinking about who internally will administer and oversee the use of funds. And this includes determining allowability of projects. Is it going to be county or municipal employed grant administrator? Is it going to be your finance staff? Is it going to be legal counsel? Are you going to consult that out? But you really need to think about who will have final decision authority and who will make those allowability assessments and document and be able to defend those allowability assessments. As you start to review the Treasury guidance, there's a lot of gray area. So it's not as easy as just picking items off a list and saying, yes, Treasury list this item, so it's allowable. There's lots of interpretations that need to be made, and you'll need to identify who on your staff will be doing that work. The next item is how will funds be administered and monitored? If you're spending all the money internally at the county or municipal level, that's fairly easy. If you're entering into lots of vendor contracts or grant agreements, subrecipient relationships, it becomes more difficult. Do you have programmatic staff? Do you have grant staff? Do you have finance staff who are going to be doing the monitoring, the reporting, the closeout? Are you going to have to hire some temporary employees, look at staff augmentation, bring in consultants. So what that process will look like. What process will be used to communicate, capture data, identify direct and indirect costs, develop reporting and performance measure indicators, metrics, standards. This is a mouthful, and it's meant to be. When Treasury came out with the compliance and reporting guidance a couple weeks ago, there is much more a focus on outcomes, meeting goals, performance measures, than there was with the CARES Act CRF. CARES Act was really about counting widgets, how many recipients, how many payments, how much money went out the door. This go around, it's much more about outcomes and performance measures. Also, with the CARES Act CRF, there was limited use of admin dollars and no use of indirect cost recoverables. With the ARPA dollars, you can do both. So for jurisdictions that have a negotiated indirect cost rate, how are you going to apply that rate to these funds? For jurisdictions that don't have an indirect cost rate, do you want to pursue one? Do you want to use the de minimis 10% rate, which is allowed by the federal government to recoup some of your back office indirect cost in addition to program dollars? So not an exhaustive list, but definitely some items that a team or a committee or a leadership group within your jurisdiction should start thinking through. Lastly, what written policies and procedures are in place or need to be updated, such as allowability of cost, procurement, conflict of interest, property standards, record retention, etc. You must follow the more restrictive procurement process, either your local government's process or the federal process. This is a requirement by the Federal Uniform Guidance. The Federal Uniform Guidance was implemented in 2014, and there was a transition period that went through 2018 that allowed jurisdictions to use either or. You could either use the federal process or you could use your local process. That transition period is over. You must now have a local procurement policy that meets or exceeds the federal standards. Not burdensome, not a high bar to get over, but just something you need to sit down and kind of map and see if your current procurement policies and procedures meet the federal standards. There are also opportunities to use cooperative purchasing agreements, sole source, competition and practical, and even continued emergency procurement options, which will help alleviate some of your procurement burdens. But again, just something you need to review. And if it's not documented, make sure it's documented. Next slide. So just some continued considerations. What internal controls exist and will be used to administer this fund? Things like documentation standards, separation of duties, time and effort reporting. Many of your jurisdictions probably have these items as commonly accepted practices. Everybody just knows to do them, but they may or may not be written down somewhere. Now is an opportunity to memorialize these items and get them written down. When I'm talking about documenting these items, it's not 20-page policy and procedure manuals. It literally can be a memo to file, a couple bullet points, a paragraph, but it's imperative that you make sure these internal controls exist, they're current, and they're being adhered to. When and how will risk assessment be performed, including SAM.gov verification? Again, this was really something that you didn't need to pay attention to with CARES Act CRF, but it's critical to do with these ARPA funds when allocating money out to subrecipients. So you're going to give money to small businesses or nonprofits through subaward or subgrant relationships. These are requirements through the uniform guidance. A risk assessment could be based on past performance with an organization. It can be a review of their last annual audit. It could be a questionnaire that you provide them, how long their leadership has been in place, do they have experience with managing other federal grants, something like that. Um, and the RO is developing samples, and there's also some really good samples available online of risk assessments. And then SAM.gov verification. You need to make sure that your subrecipients and vendors, for that matter, are registered with SAM.gov and they're not listed as being suspended or debarred from receiving federal funds. It's a pretty quick and easy process. It's just something that somebody needs to do, and you need to document it. And normally that's done through a print screen. So you would search for an organization, they would come up, they're listed as not being suspended or debarred. You do a print screen with sam.gov and save it to a file. How will determinations of subrecipient versus vendors be made? This again is another federal uniform guidance requirement. It helps you determine how you're going to allocate money to these organizations. If you determine that you're going to have a vendor relationship, then your jurisdiction's procurement policies kick in. If you determine you're going to have a subrecipient relationship, then you don't have to go through your formal procurement policies. You would just have to follow whatever process you have for making grant awards. Again, there are some tools out there to help you do vendor versus subrecipient determinations. Essentially, it comes down to programmatic discretion. If you are partnering with a food manufacturer to deliver 1,000 meals, that's a vendor relationship. If you're partnering with a food bank who will deliver meals to the community, and it's an undetermined number of meals, how they will deliver that to the community, what the program participants will look like. So they have some discretion on implementation. That's usually how the differentiation is made between vendor and subrecipient relationship. This can also be done at several points in the process. You can do it very early on during program design, or you can do it on an applicant by applicant basis. So just another consideration to be made. What will be the process used to determine and allocate funds to external entities? Do you have a grant procurement policy in addition to your regular procurement policy? Do you have a grants management manual that governs the allocation of subawards? Has your community typically run a grant program for nonprofits and you want to leverage that same process? Are you going to have internal staff serve as peer reviewers to review these applications? Are you going to have scoring rubrics or selection criteria? Again, it doesn't have to be formal, but it should be written down, just a few key bullets. And it does not have to be a one-size-fits-all. One program that might be highly competitive could go through a very structured process. Another program that's not so competitive, a very general and loose process. Again, the key is documentation. How will grant programs be designed and administered? Types of document templates available or needs, such as applications, award documents, agreements, those sort of things. Does your jurisdiction already have existing MOAs, MOUs, grant agreements, etc.? And if so, do they include the necessary data elements required by the Federal Uniform Guidance? Within the Federal Uniform Guidance, if you enter into a subrecipient relationship, there's a whole series of data elements that have to be included in these documents. DUNS numbers, federal award ID numbers, project periods, CFDA, things like that. So you might have existing grant agreements, you might have existing MOAs that will need to be updated to meet the compliance standards, or you might have to build them from scratch. Again, the Office of Recovery is working on developing many of these templates and job aids. But if there are specific items that you think would be helpful, please reach out using the inquiry form to let us know what will be the most benefit to you. Next slide. So this slide incorporates steps into the design and implementation of what to do now to administer and manage the funds in accordance with your award terms and conditions. These high-level steps are, so designate an individual or entity responsible for administration, including backup for unanticipated situations or circumstances that may occur. This is not necessarily the certifying official or the backup that you used in requesting funds. This would be the individual within your organization who's going to have day-to-day responsibility. It could be programmatic staff, it could be finance staff, it could be legal counsel. Every community is going to do it a little bit differently. Once you've identified these individuals, assess the experience and expertise of these individuals when it comes to federal grants management and compliance, and invest now in training and professional development to help support these individuals. There are lots of resources out there. Grants.gov, which is a publicly available website, has a Grants 101 Academy, which is probably a good place to start for general grants management training. The uniform guidance document is publicly available, but lots of organizations, National Association of Counties, National League of Cities, and others have put out really good information. But my recommendation would give these individuals a little space and time to do some training and professional development before they get thrust right into the day-to-day administration of these funds. Check and revise internal controls to include allowance for direct and indirect cost. Who's going to make those determinations? How are they going to get billed? Separation of duties, programmatic performance and compliance. Again, this is a priority area for Treasury, and general best practices. You need to know that your internal controls exist, are maintained, and probably most importantly, they're adhered to. Oh yeah, we have that policy as a procedure. It's sitting on a file on a shelf, but nobody really pays attention to it because it's pretty burdensome. So we just, we get the work done a simpler, different way. Adherence to your internal controls is critical. One recommendation about internal controls is to self-scout or monitor yourselves. Designate someone not affiliated with the process to review your internal controls as well as other policies and procedures to make sure they're consistent and comprehensive. If they make sense to a layperson who's not involved in the day-to-day work, then you're probably in pretty good shape. And then also just regularly review and perform process improvement. The CARES Act CRF was a 9-month sprint. This is a 4-year marathon. So document, but continue to update those documentation over time. You also should be reviewing and updating written policies and procedures, fiscal, personnel, procurement, conflict of interest, mandatory disclosure for fraud, waste, and abuse. It is suggested to consider implementing a process to make sure written policies and procedures are followed. Not only developing them, but then providing them to staff, making staff sign on that they've received them, and again, self-scout and monitor. If there are common practices that serve as kind of informal policies and procedures, make sure they're written down. If they're written down, again, make sure they are adhered to. Not following existing policies and procedures, along with arbitrary and capricious decision-making, are two of the biggest red flags for the federal grantors. So right, wrong, or indifferent, if you make a policy interpretation, you make a decision, you document it, you consistently follow it, generally the federal government is going to work with you and be okay with it. It's when you do a lot of one-off arbitrary decisions, every scenario is handled a little bit differently, that you really kind of get crosswise with the federal government. Establish communication and work plans. It's suggested to refer to and review these plans regularly and also update them when changes are needed. Again, during CARES Act and CRF, 9 months, you probably didn't have a lot of staff turnover, people being promoted, people changing roles, people leaving your organization. Over 4 years with the ARPA Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, unfortunately, that's likely to happen. There's going to be a lot of change. You're going to have people leave. So updating these communications and work plans is going to be critical. This would also include establishing file structures and clearinghouses for information. And when you're developing these communication plans, avoid creating bottlenecks where all information has to originate from or flow through a single individual. Again, we're getting back to business as normal. This is an emergency response to a pandemic. We had numerous individuals at organizations all across the country who stepped up big time and really put the allocation of the CARES Act on their back and did heroic work. That's not sustainable. These people are burning out. These people have day jobs. Now that we have a little time to return to the new normal, think about work groups, committees, shared responsibilities, and communications plans that make sense and spread the burden evenly throughout the organization. Next slide. So the next several slides are going to focus on subrecipient or subaward process, as the assumption is that most jurisdictions will have more experience with vendor transactions. The reality is that many of the oversight and compliance responsibilities are the same regardless. They just look and feel a little bit different if it's a formal vendor or contract versus a grant agreement and subrecipient relationship. You'll want to be developing an allocation of funds process before funds are obligated and dispersed is important to administering and managing the funds received. We're seeing a lot of jurisdictions right now that are thinking about the investment opportunities, but they're not thinking about the process. They're not thinking about the how, the mechanism that they will need to actually move forward on those investment opportunities. So a strong recommendation to really slow down and focus on the how and the mechanism, and not so much the what what the money will be spent on. So we've mentioned some of these before, but just wanted to put them in kind of a bulleted list. Conduct subrecipient versus vendor determinations. Really want to highlight this because this is a critical step that is oftentimes skipped by jurisdictions. Perform risk assessments. One of the takeaways from the CARES Act CRF is a lot of jurisdictions were trying to do risk assessments retroactively. So instead of doing them upfront, because there was such a push to get money out the door, they were trying to recreate risk assessments at closeout. So strongly encourage you to build that into your upfront process. Determine the criteria for awarding of funds. Are you going to have a scoring matrix, peer review, internal, external panel of reviewers, that sort of thing. Determine or set objectives to meet program objectives and key performance indicators. If you start to look at the compliance and reporting guidance that's come out from Treasury, they're not just counting widgets. They're wanting outcomes. They want goals. They want use of structured evaluations, more academic reviews, use of things like logic models. So really spend some time looking at that. If you're designing a program that does not have clear performance indicators, or you don't have the ability to collect that data, then that's probably a project that needs to be struck from your list because it's just not going to be viable going forward. Describe in writing how funds will be awarded, dispersed, and documented. Again, doesn't have to be very fancy, but make sure you have it written down. Much easier to do this documentation now than trying to recreate it 2 years from now, 3 years from now. when the Treasury Office of Inspector General comes in and wants to look at your policies and procedures. Develop a list of potential entities eligible for awarding of funds. If the types of organizations do not exist in your community and or they don't have the capacity experience, don't force a program. You might want to implement something in your community, but the capacity is just not there yet. So don't force a program. Maybe look at pilot projects or capacity development over time. So maybe in 2 or 3, year 2 or year 3, you could implement the program you want, but maybe not right out of the gate in year 1. And then consider what documents and or templates to use and retain in your award files. Be thinking 5 years out. Who will be around, what historical knowledge they will have, and where best to save and store this information. I think I talk about it on another slide, but you really have to get key decisions out of emails, off of people's personal computers, desktops, and into a centralized file location. As part of developing an allocation of funds process, determine what types of allocations of funds will be made. Will you be doing lots of internal projects, providing funds within your internal operations for counties, cities, and NEUs? Or is most of your funding going to go out external to community-based organizations, subrecipients through grant programs? Generally speaking, internal transfers or projects implemented directly by your jurisdiction will have fewer compliance and reporting responsibilities and burdens than external projects. Usually you're just talking about setting up a fund and billing to that fund. So not a lot of moving parts. For external programs, vendor transactions will generally require more upfront work and have longer lead times because you have to work through that procurement process, potentially even formal requests for proposals. Whereas subrecipient transactions will be quicker to implement, but have greater back-end monitoring and other compliance responsibilities. There's no right or wrong answer here, just considerations for you to be thinking through. Next slide. After you determine the type of allocation of funds to make, if you're going down the subrecipient road, here are some considerations. You must have a signed agreement or record of award with award terms and conditions. This is not debatable. It's not negotiable. Actually, Treasury themselves got written up for this issue with the CARES Act CRF because they didn't issue formal grant agreements when allocating the funding. So you must have a grant agreement. It could be an MOA, it could be an MOU, but just be aware of that. On that agreement, you have to include all federally required data elements, FAIN, CFDA, project periods, etc. Review and acknowledgement of subrecipient financial and progress reports. You have to have a mechanism for collecting that information from your subs. Know that subrecipient supporting documentation is accessible and available as requested. It could be 100% sample where your subrecipients are submitting it all the time when they're requesting payment, or just available upon request when you're performing monitoring. Verify subrecipient has and uses a procurement policy. They have internal policies and procedures, internal controls, record retention. This could be part of your risk assessment. This could be part of your post-award monitoring. It could be part of your closeout process, but you'll need to make sure you're doing that. Single audit compliance, confirmation of subrecipient single audit if they're going to meet the $750,000 threshold, and then monitor and document, communicate findings, including follow-up or corrective actions to be taken for compliance. Again, broken record at this point, but open communication between you and your subrecipients And documentation are key to addressing these subrecipient considerations. Next slide. So should you determine that a grant program is a type of allocation of funds to be used, considerations to address in advance of developing the grant program, establish a written program design and timeline. Is it going to be advertised publicly? Are you going to have an application process? What is the criteria? How will funds be distributed? Are you going to make advancements of payment? Are you going to do it on a reimbursement basis? How will the ongoing reporting work? And what the closeout process will be. Does not have to be an overly complicated process, doesn't have to be an extensive process, nor does it have to be a one-size-fits-all. You could have a different process for different programs. Perform applicant tests to ensure a potential awardee will meet stipulations and requirements of award agreements, including suspension and debarment. Think about capacity development along with chunking support into maybe a pilot phase, planning phase, development, implementation, if you have concerns with the applicant and their ability to manage the award. Have fully signed and dated agreements. We talked about that briefly, but I will add here, you need to make sure they're updated over time. So if they receive a project period extension, a budget modification, if there are changes of key personnel or contacts, changes to scope, when auditors come in, it's really a two-part test. Is the activity allowable? Yes or no. But also, is the activity authorized in the existing agreement? Yes or no. Many organizations fail this second test because they don't keep the materials updated over time. With CARES Act CRF, we saw lots of initial agreements for PPE, and then over time, those agreements switch to, overtime or hazard duty pay, and the agreements were never updated, and that becomes an issue. And then have capacity to monitor and maintain each award. All the grantee information, amount awarded, purpose, award date, documentation. Monitoring comes in many different varieties, desk reviews, phone interviews, on-site, pre-closeout, but also know that a risk-based approach or a sample are certainly appropriate methodologies. So if you make 100 grant awards, you don't necessarily have to monitor all 100. You could do a 10% sample, a 20% sample, or just a risk-based sample. Next slide. So other considerations to address in advance of pre-award external allocation of funds, have consistent approaches and requirements, avoid individual staff approaches that differ greatly and are arbitrary and capricious decision-making. Consider an organizational grant management manual that establishes minimum standards. Again, does not have to be exhaustive, but just some key concepts and policies. Anticipate unexpected issues. You receive fewer applications received, and you have to quickly reallocate funds. Have a plan B, and always budget additional time into your timelines. And then maintaining a central records and file depository located for a 5 to 8 year strategy. Again, get critical information out of emails, document phone calls, and off of individual computers and desktops. If it isn't written down, or if no one can find the documentation, it did not happen in the eyes of the federal government. So really focus on that. And on our next webinar, we'll focus on this in greater detail and give you some very specific examples of the types of documentation you should have and how exhaustive that documentation needs to look like. Next slide. So we're rapidly running out of time, but the content presented today provides you the foundations to develop your local fiscal recovery fund program in compliance with award terms and conditions. Some next steps to take are address considerations and begin initial setup for funds received. Review your award terms and conditions in detail along with the Treasury guidance. Unfortunately, this is a never-ending process, with Treasury issuing additional FAQs. Also, spend some time exploring the current terms and conditions in your grant agreements, like the administrative cost and indirect cost provisions. Perform due diligence and technical review of initial setup. Again, use non-grant staff and staff unrelated to the day-to-day administration of funding to review. If it appears comprehensive to them and makes sense, then you're probably in good shape. Establish your allocation process for award and your disbursement methodologies. Access needs to determine allowable uses of fund to allocate funds based on Treasury's eligible categories. Look at your existing capital project plans, park master plans, IT plans, etc., as starting points. Your jurisdictions have invested in a lot of time and garnered considerable stakeholder engagement to develop these materials. Don't start from scratch if you don't have to, and chase projects that are not part of the core mission and vision of your organization. Really leverage that existing work that's been done. Design American Rescue Plan program to respond to the pandemic and promote economic recovery. Look to cover existing and short-term needs, but also develop midterm and longer-term strategies that help position your jurisdiction going forward. And then finally, just document. You can't go wrong by writing it down. And with that, webinars in future weeks will provide more details to guide design and implementation of your program. And we will consistently or routinely come back and touch on allowability concepts, as well as starting the office hours tomorrow. And with that, I will wrap it up and we will try and answer some questions. Micah, do you have some, do you want to pull out for me or?
Yes, I'm in the process of looking through. I think we've actually been able to answer most of the questions live.
Matt, this is Andrea. If anybody has submitted an application and hasn't received a submission email, they can submit a request through the contact us form on our website, and we will confirm that the submission has been received.
One other item I failed to mention is that we are currently working on an allowability matrix. This is not an exhaustive, answer every question about allowability, but will help jurisdictions think about those activities that are likely allowable, somewhat allowable, and not likely allowable. And we hope to finalize that and have it available in the next week or so. I know there's a lot of gray areas in the guidance, so hopefully this will help frame that conversation for your jurisdiction.
We also have a question about submitting the application through the portal on the Treasury's website. And I just thought it might be helpful to confirm which entity submits in which way again. So non-entitlement units or NEUs submit through the state application, and counties and the metropolitan cities, the larger, submit through the Treasury site. So depending on which type of entity you are would follow where you submit.
I think there were a couple questions about admin and indirect cost and what the difference is. There is no cap on use of administrative cost. The uniform guidance standard is reasonable, appropriate. But unlike those jurisdictions that received an allocation through Spark and ERO with CARES Act that had a 5% cap, now that you're a direct recipient, there is no specific cap. And then indirect cost is completely different. If you have a rate, a previously negotiated federal rate, you can apply that. If you don't, those rates take several years to establish, but the federal government has introduced a provision where you can use a 10% de minimis or provisional rate for up to 5 years. So for a jurisdiction that wanted to recoup indirect cost right away, you could use that 10% rate. So definitely something to review and look into. Also, just a reminder that the Recovery Office is working on a master services contract. I hope to be finalized in the next several weeks for jurisdictions that might want or need additional support, whether that be staff augmentation, accounting, grants management, audit, reporting. So that resource will be available here shortly as well.
Matt, we just received a question asking if there is a specific way that NEUs and local governments can ask if a project is in accordance with the use of LFRF money.
That really, as a direct recipient, having a direct recipient with Treasury, that responsibility ultimately relies on, falls on the local community. Through the inquiry process, we have been trying to point to FAQs that hopefully provide some clarity on that. The allowability matrix that I mentioned will help with that. But ultimately, a jurisdiction is going to have to gauge their own sort of internal comfort level and risk tolerance when making those allowability decisions. Certainly, things like consultants help, but even a consultant is just providing advice and counsel. Ultimately, the jurisdiction is going to have to make that decision. I will tell you that documenting your rationale is probably the best defense. So if you are trying to determine if a stormwater project is an allowable use of the funding, pointing to the FAQ that talks about stormwater, citing the language from the interim final rule, pulling out the sections from the compliance and reporting guidance, just 2 or 3 or 4 bullets on how you came to your decision is usually your best defense in justifying that allowability decision. Anything else, Micah, that you see?
No, I believe that's all the questions that we've received so far. Other questions that have been placed have already been answered. We did also, though, just receive a question from Jeanette. What reporting level applies to revenue loss funds received?
The compliance and reporting guidance document that was just issued has a little bit of information. We're still waiting on additional guidance, but it will be sort of a 2-part reporting requirement. You will have to report out on how you developed your revenue loss calculations, and then you will still have to report out on what you did with that funding. So the provision of government services. You won't have a lot of the same goals and performance outcome data, but you will have to report out on how that money was used. And again, the revenue loss or revenue replacement is a little bit of misleading because it's not just restoring fund balances. Once you generate the revenue loss, you then have to use it for the provision of government services going forward. So there will be a programmatic activity associated with the revenue loss funds. A question just came in on how to, for very small non-entitlement units, how to reduce the administrative burdens. Infrastructure, provision of government services, keeping the money internally. So if an NEU has a stormwater project or wants to establish Wi-Fi hotspots at parks or libraries or anchor institutions, if you have some public health and safety staff salaries, anything that where you limit vendor and subrecipient relationships and transactions is going to reduce your oversight and compliance responsibilities. So that would be my best recommendation to you. Anything else, Micah?
No, I believe that's it. I know we are coming up on the top of the hour. If there are any other questions, please submit them in the chat. We'll be here for a few more minutes.
And again, thanks everybody for attending. We've started these conversations at kind of the 30,000 foot level. We're, gradually, diving deeper, hopefully providing, relevant and timely information without overwhelming everybody. But we will continue to discuss these topics and get more and more into detail going forward. Alyssa, it looks like you're on mute.
The other thing that I would ask is if you all have colleagues or friends in other communities that are not on this call or aren't receiving our emails, please reach out, talk to them. We want to make sure that we're reaching everyone. We've got a short amount of time, especially for the NEU dollars, to get those out to folks. And so we can use everybody's help in making sure that all communities are applying, getting their funds, and make sure that we have good contacts for everyone. So please, if you're talking to someone from another community, make sure they're aware. So we have a question from Afton. Is there a listserv for administrators of these grants to communicate? So there currently isn't. We have a listserv that we are using to communicate to you, but as one of our goals is to be able to provide connections amongst you all. I don't know also if the league or KAC is planning to do that, but as we know that folks are doing similar types of projects or things like that, that's one of the goals of our local government liaison team, is to be able to connect you with similar folks. So we are working on that, and I think that that's a great idea, and we will definitely take that under advisement. All right, we are top of the hour. If we did not get to anyone's question, or if you have other questions, please use the contact us form at covid.ks.gov. We will send, that's a good place to request the link to the portal if you don't have that. But it is in the upper right-hand corner of covid.ks.gov. Anything else?